Okay, this is the second lecture, judicial process. We're going to focus on a couple of things. Hopefully as much of this as we can before we run out of time, in which case the lecture would just carry over to the third lecture. So we're going to look at Rawls' economic theory of justice, the veil of ignorance. The importance of that is we first want to establish, okay, is there a commonality amongst people about what kind of government they would expect or what they expect from the state? Is there some sort of agreement? Can we get to a place where we know this is what everybody wants and the state should be expected to deliver that? And then once we establish that, we're going to just take a peek through the tragedy of commons, why it's one of the reasons why it's difficult to maintain that sort of agreement or how that's being taken advantage of. And we'll also look at, we'll jump ahead from that to the idea of antitrust and patents. Again, this is more of an exploratory, but here's how this also, the process can be manipulated. So we'll look into horizontal and vertical mergers, and we'll go into some data on the Department of Justice to show you just how much money and focus is being placed on this idea of antitrust, which has to do with sort of ways in which corporations can corrupt the efficiencies of the marketplace. And then we'll look at a Pigovian tax, which is a way of sort of the government saying, okay, you've done something, a corporation, that's problematic for a third party, polluted some water, whatever, and we're going to tax you because you just brought about an inefficiency. As we mentioned yesterday, in the capitalist market, there's the invisible hand. And so all the assumptions that these things are efficient, right? There's an efficiency to the market moving with that invisible hand. And then we're going to talk about the relationship between the state and the people. And we're going to go over some philosophers, not in great depth, just give you sort of an overview of what their particular bent is in terms of what the state's responsibility should be. And we're talking about Hobbes and Rousseau and Locke, whose second treatise on government is pretty much what Thomas Jefferson, as I mentioned yesterday, lifted the ideas from, not all of them. Hegel, Bethlehem Marx, and then contemporary views. And then we're going to look at just these types of judges that fill the system and are responsible for the process. And that will be, lay judges and, professional judges, civic judges, common law judges. And then we'll look at the Constitution of the United States about the structure of judges and so on and so forth. So there's a couple of goals here, right? The first goal is to try and determine the nature of the goals and the structures, procedures we've talked about, and processes that divine what people want from their government and expect the government to deliver. And then the second thing is looking at, theories about the state. What is the state's purpose? What's the purpose of individuals in the state? And then finally, the types of judges in the judicial process and their purpose. So hopefully we'll get to a lot of this, but we'll see. Okay, so I want to start with an economic theory of justice. Fundamentally, the question was, all right, are there principles of justice, and can we guarantee some sort of just and morally acceptable society? If we're going to come together, which we will, as I said in the last lecture, to form a state or a government, there's got to be a rationale for doing that. And then once there's a goal for doing it, a rationale, you then look at processes and procedures and that sort of thing. And hopefully those will actually satisfy the goals that were ascribed to in the very beginning. So the first principle is to guarantee the right of each person to have the most extensive, basic liberties compatible with the liberties of others. And that's really an important concept. Your liberties, your freedoms must end where the freedoms of others begin. In other words, my rights should not supersede your rights. But it's in that in-between, it's that space between how far my rights go and where the rights of another begin that the process, in a lot of ways, is supposed to deal with. Right? Basically decide what one can do and what one cannot do. So a simple example of this is, can I take the life of another? Someone has wronged me, right? They've done something, and can I take the life of another? Or does another person have the right to protect themselves, to defend themselves against someone trying to take their life? Why is that important? Because you can't get a more basic or fundamental right than the right to exist, right? We have that right not given to us by government, by really, us as human beings in nature. We have a natural right, like all other things on the planet. You struggle to continue to exist. So no one's freedoms or liberties can cross that line. But again, that really depends where that line is, depends upon the structure, the goals, the process, and the procedures we put in place through our legal system in order to basically make a determination about where that line is going to be. And that line, by the way, will move. It's not stagnant. We don't decide on it and it stays there. Part of the idea of precedent is that new circumstances, new developments occur, and then we have to figure out where those lines are. And when we get to the second half of the course, when we look at cases, you'll begin to see how the court really exacts, and determines, divines where that particular line is going to be. So going back to Rawls again, the second principle is social and economic positions. Where are they supposed to be? And they should be to the advantage of everyone. So how are we going to get at this, right? So what the assumption that Rawls makes is that if we put people behind a veil of ignorance, they don't really know who they are, right? More or less. And I'll give you my example of that, which are brains in a jar. But fundamentally, you don't know who you are, and then we say, okay, what would you like? What should the world look like? And of course, because you don't know who you are, you want a perfectly equal, if such a thing exists, world where certain rights are immutable, where basically the state has to protect those rights at a bare minimum. And so what Rawls does is he says, okay, so we put people behind this veil of ignorance, and all the players in that particular social game are placed in a situation which is called original position. That's sort of, where they don't know basically who they are. Having only a general knowledge of the facts, about life in society, right? So they know what they're dealing with, what they're supposed to, what particular, venue they're in. Okay, we're talking about this, life in society. And then the question is, to abide based on their moral obligation. There's that word again. So basically, we do that by just denying them information about themselves. And it forces them to adopt a generalized point of view that bears a strong resemblance to a moral point of view. Right? Okay, now, this is why there's so many definitions up front that I gave you. You have to remember these. So moral conclusions, this is what he said, I'm quoting, moral conclusions can be reached without abandoning the prudential standpoint of positioning a moral outlook merely by pursuing one's own prudential reasoning under certain procedural, bargaining, and knowledge constraints. Sounds very convoluted. But really all he's saying is that you can reach a point of agreement, right? With certain sort of then procedures that can not necessarily guarantee it, but certainly keep an eye on it. So what Rawls is really proposing is sort of the most reasonable principle of justice that, for any given society, are that those individuals would themselves agree to if they were behind this veil of ignorance. They didn't know who they were. They just kind of knew they were talking about a state or a society, and what should that look like, and what rights should people have. So now, the assumption is that each person there is a moral person, that they understand what's good and what's right in general terms. If they don't understand anything about that, even in nature, they don't understand what's right or wrong, this is pretty much impossible to pull off. So what the veil of ignorance brings out is that we can accept utilitarianism, right? Utility, as a public conception of justice, but only if we're prepared to let someone be subject to conditions we would not be prepared to subject ourselves. Again, the veil of ignorance brings out that we can accept this utility as a public conception, for maximize utility of justice. This is what justice will be. if we're prepared to let someone be subject to conditions, we would not be prepared to subject ourselves. Okay? So what we're looking at here is we put people behind this veil of ignorance. They kind of know we're talking about putting together a state. And the question is, do unto others as you have them do unto you, right? That basically, what kind of structure would you put in place? And so each person trying to maximize the outcome of what that state might look like, they're going to come up with processes, procedures, and leave that to someone else. They're going to understand that, but they're going to say, okay, here's what we want the state to provide. So if this goes well, then the principles that come up with create an equal distribution of the pie, if you will, right? This is not sustainable, everyone getting that piece of the pie, unless it's pursued or strived for, which means it doesn't come natural. Once you know what it is, it takes then effort, and it takes focus, and it takes structure, and it takes procedure and process in order to get there. And obviously the goals would be what you arrive at when you begin this process of being behind the veil. So everyone's engaged. There's no idle observation. Everyone's engaged. And you're talking about getting to the point where you have equally moral persons. And the choice is, what do you wish to possess materially? What do you really want? As intellectually, because you're not really doing it. And within, obviously, the capability of human beings to actually do. Right? We don't want everyone to fly. That's not the point. So these principles should promote equality among all. The fundamental principles they come up with when they're behind the veil of ignorance, don't know who they are, but know they're putting together a state. What should that state do? And that what the state should do is tied exactly to what would give the greatest amount of equality and liberty to the greatest number of people. That's utility. To pursue their own ends, keeping in mind that liberties have to end where the liberties of others begin. All right? So everyone has the basic liberties and opportunities, right? That's the point. If you can't get on the playing field, you don't know if you can succeed or not. And fundamentally, one of the things we all want is, I want to play the game. I don't want to not be permitted to play that game. I'm willing to play it and do poorly at it and accept that I don't belong doing it. Last lecture I talked about basketball, that my playing would require, in a meritocracy, my being able to do certain things. If I can't do them, it's like, give us the ball, get off the court. And that's fair, right? But all of life is not discernible, it's not discernible to start off with. But also, it's not, as we talked about in the last lecture, we all don't have those same, whether it's genetically or whatever, we're not all similar in all ways, okay? But we all have a moral obligation then to accept the existence of every other human being, and that all people become equal in their position and desires. In other words, we all have a right to pursue those things which we find, will fulfill us in some way. So we have the basic powers then of choice, right? And acting on those choices with a sense of justice. Okay, that's all sounds very common, but here it comes down to, this is the brains in a jar. And then I'll finish up with roles. But just to clarify this, my way of explaining it is, if I took everyone's brain and put it in a jar, and they could still communicate, but you have no idea about anything. You don't know really who you are or what the structure's going to be. That is to say, you can think, but you have no other information that we talked about in the first lecture. You don't know your genetics, what they're going to be. You don't know your physical parents, your capacities. You don't know under what system you might live. The idea is to create that system. So the brains in a jar, they would come up with this sort of moral structure, right, where you get some utility. Everybody should pursue their own ends to maximize their, we'll say, happiness. Their well-being is a much better way to put it. Their well-being as they perceive it, with the constraint of, your liberty to pursue that must end where the rights of others begin. And so once you determine all of this, what it's going to look like, then your brain comes out of the jar and it goes into a body in a period of time, in a set of circumstances, and then you have to seek out, you have to take those things which you agree to while you were just a brain in a jar, you have to respect those and you have to move towards their fulfillment, putting structures and processes in place in a state, right, that would be able to either guarantee those or prevent them from being somehow vacated. All right, so the responsibility then of the procedure and the growth relies on each and every individual, right? By doing this, what are we going to do? We're going to create a level playing field, which I talked about. Is this a form of pure competition, perfect competition? Is that what it is? Well, it seems that way. Everybody pursuing their own ends, constrained by some sort of line that determines what you can and cannot do. And it's that line that's going to become really interesting for us, because really the entire process, judicial process, is about determining where that line is based on reason and fact and so on. And that line's going to move as the culture moves, and that's a good thing. And we're not going to get into in any real depth at all about an activist court and all of that, except when we deal with a couple of the cases. But the point is that that's the job of the process, right? To adjust and manage so that what we have is we have a likelihood of really producing the most equal society we can get. So competition is good, right? Because it's desired, because it tells us, again, I can play the game, but not very well. So I leave the field knowing that I had an opportunity. Having an opportunity but not succeeding is different than having no opportunity at all, right? You just want to get on the field. And that's really the job of government, to make sure that you have access. And then it's the job of the courts to really make a judgment about whether you crossed the line or didn't cross the line. And it can be something simple in the sports analogy. Crossing the line is expecting yourself to play when you really have no talent. So, for example, I love baseball, so I would love to own the Yankees. But let's say I did own the Yankees. I couldn't say, you know what? My fantasy is to play shortstop. And so I'm going to play shortstop. It's my team. I play shortstop. And so it becomes apparent to everyone, the other players, people in the fans, sports, analysts and all, that you can't play shortstop. You're horrible at it, and it's hurting the team. And the whole goal here is we get the best players to compete and hopefully, win a bunch of games so the people that come to watch us, because they don't have this athletic ability but want to watch others that do, right? That they somehow get their money's worth or what have you. But you own the team, but you don't play well. And so you lose a lot of games, you don't get advertisers, all that sort of stuff. So it's a very poor business move. But the idea here is, even though I have the power and the authority to do that, I'm constrained by the realities of that playing field. That's the thing about a meritocracy. You can't fudge it. That's why I said in the first lecture, really I can only think of very few meritocracies. One is sports, and the other is comedy, because people laugh or don't laugh. I guess you could say music, but that's really a matter of taste. I guess comedy is on some level too, but the bottom line is that the goal in comedy is to make you laugh. There's a specific goal there. And everything that's said or done, whether you like it or not, is designed to get you to that place. So there not being many meritocracies, who gets on the playing field has to be determined by someone or something. And that's where the structure comes in, right? So the idea of a competitive environment is great, because what it does is it requires all parties that are involved, right, to compete against someone else and do a better job, thereby winning greater resources, whether it's money, market share, whatever it is. That competition is a good thing, and that as people compete, to advance themselves, it actually serves a purpose of sort of sharpening all the knives in the drawer. In other words, everyone benefits by it. And an added advantage is this idea of, well, now what you've got is the free hand. No one person or group, in a perfect world here, you're going to see that this gets corrupted, and that's part of the problem. That line moves where others want it to move, not necessarily in a moral direction or guided by morality, but by some other motivation, usually some sort of wealth, accumulation of wealth or what have you. So competition is a good thing, and no one person can dictate the marketplace. When you talk about monopoly and all that stuff, you'll see that this is what corrupts the process. And that's what human beings do. When you take their head out of the jar, their brain, you put it into a body, they look in the mirror and they say, oh, I'm this thing. This is what I look like. And so I want a world that treats me better than, say, other people, right? That's human nature, and that's why the process has to be there. First, we have to determine what would be a good situation for all of us, and that's this maximization of utility based upon the liberties we agree on that are fundamental and can't be changed, that hopefully lead us to compete and so on. All right, so the idea of competition is really important to the process, and without it, it's problematic. So what are we talking about? What kinds of things do we want? We want that. We want a fair equality for opportunity, which is getting on that playing field. We want to have all forms of discrimination, right, removed, right? We want that removed from races, ethnic origin, social standards should be such. Religious intolerance and beliefs should be kept in check. And so all of these are this component of this individual person, thus making that person an individual. In other words, what describes them. The brain goes into the body and all that stuff, race, social standing, all that. There's your card. Here's who you are now. We've taken you out of the jar, and here's who you are. Or we've removed you, or we've removed the veil of ignorance, and now you know. And the corruption starts. And that's why the judicial process is important, because that corruption will come fast and furious, because everyone feels like they are vying for, as I mentioned in the first lecture, limited resources or scarce resources. And so everybody wants as much of that as they can get. And that includes people that want those 12 houses. You know, I feel okay with one, but I'm really secure with 12. And there's also a competition. You know, that guy is worth, more, has more houses. I want to compete against it. I got to get more houses. The standards change. I talked yesterday again about sports, basketball, that you can't say, who the GOAT is, the greatest of all time, because it changes because other things change, which change the ability requirements to succeed. Remember an interview with Bird and Magic Johnson, and each was asked, who's the better player? Of course, they each said the other one was. And then the standard, Bird said, no, Magic, because the goal is to win championships. And he won more championships than I did. So that would make him the better player, because the goal is to win the championships. It's not necessarily about who scores the most points, right? If you're sort of the star or the leader of the team, say like a Michael Jordan or whatever, the goal is to win championships. And I saw a recent picture of, Jordan with all the rings he's won on his fingers. And he talked about LeBron James only having 4. Talk about competitive, right? You only got 4. I've got 6. I don't want to hear that you're better, And it wasn't done in a mean-spirited way. It was done in a, sort of in-your-face for fun way. Get the 2 more rings and then we'll talk. All right. So, and that's a perfectly reasonable standard, because the whole point of the game is to win championships, win games. And if someone's part of a team that does that, then that means that they played better because their team won more. Reasonable. For Magic's, sort of standard was points and scoring and being able to do more things on the floor. That he had a certain skill set, and that skill set was in some areas better than his skill set. That made him a better player. I'm not sure what the standard should be. They're both incredibly, great players. So you can take that all with a grain of salt. Okay, so now we know who we are, and we begin that corruption process. So let me give you some examples of things that corrupt the process and infringe upon the liberties and freedoms and the utility that each person gets from engaging in the system. In other words, they cheat the system, and everyone suffers. When you introduce an inefficiency to maximize your liberty or your wealth or whatever it is, that corrupts the process, right? The idea is that if you can manipulate the state and the structure, you can do so in a way that allows you to benefit in some way, either philosophically, wealth-wise is usually the big one, or just power. Human beings love power. I don't care if you're a media personality, a politician, a movie star, whatever it may be. So one example is the tragedy of the commons. And here, it's another economic theory that basically says, look, individuals use up resources, right, shared by many to benefit themselves. This is the corruption, right? So the standard idea here is that, individuals, if they can get a free ride, if they can get more than they've paid for, right, if they can benefit in some way, they'll cheat. Now, none of us is morally perfect. We don't always do what's good. We do what's sometimes good just for us, maybe at someone else's expense. I was talking to someone I know, and they ordered something from Amazon. And Amazon said it was delivered, and they showed a picture of where it was delivered, and the person said, this wasn't my address. I don't recognize where this package is. So someone else got delivered to them, and they were bemoaning the fact that, well, no one's going to return it, right? Because they're not going to say, oh, I see the address is wrong here. Let me go bring it to the person who really ordered this and paid for it. Their thing is, well, the system is such that that person can probably get in touch with Amazon, and Amazon will deliver another package, and no one will really care what happened to the first. So as he was explaining it, they said they delivered a second package and a picture, and this time it looked somewhat familiar, and he had an idea where it was. And so he opened up this bin where, patio furniture, cushions and stuff were stored, and he realized that was the first picture. Now there were two boxes in there, and so he now had two orders of the same thing. So I asked, so what did you do? Did you do the morally correct thing? Did you send one back because you already got your package and it was your error that you didn't recognize the inside of the bin with the first picture, but kind of recognized it with the second? And they said, no. Amazon's a big company, and the company that made it, this happened, so someone else will reimburse them. And so, no, I kept it. And I said, how is it any different than someone getting it at their house and it's not theirs and not delivering it to you? I mean, they kept something that wasn't theirs and you kept something that wasn't yours that you didn't pay for. So you're just as corrupt as they are. With that, my friend gave me a very philosophical, lecture with one of his fingers. And that was the end of the conversation. A good chuckle was had, and he knew and I knew and we all know, right, that you should have returned it, right? If you saw someone drop a $20 bill on the floor, right, would you go over and say, well, you dropped this $20 bill, or would you just kind of look around, no one's there, and pick it up and put it in your pocket and say, well, they should have paid attention? Little things like that are little things. We're going to talk about massive things that really hurt a lot of people. But the fundamental idea is there, right? What would you do that would maybe hurt you but benefit the larger system? Hurt you not because it took a resource from you, but fundamentally it didn't give you more resources, but those resources wouldn't have belonged to you to start off with. So the tragedy of the commons is, people have cows or grazing animals, and there's no charge to graze them on the community commons. And so some people think, well, I'm going to take a lot of my cows and I'm going to graze there a lot because I don't have to pay for it. And eventually, if everyone pursues that end, the commons get destroyed and the resource is depleted, and no one really benefits except for the person up front that maybe took a lot of, grass or whatever for themselves. So the idea here is, though, it's important, right, for us to understand that the commons, right, refers to any naturally occurring resource. Okay, resources are really important because everything that we create depends upon having the resources to create it. Now, creating it efficiently and whether the market wants it, that's beside the point now, right? What we're talking about is that you need resources for everything. One of the reasons for expansion, as I mentioned already, of the Soviet Union was to get, when it existed, was to get to warm water ports so they could get goods and services out, as well as their armada, as well as their military. China is really buying up all South America by using the capitalist structure to draw people in so they can get their control over their natural resources. China is trying to become, to have the dominant currency that all other currencies are sort of pegged to, because that gives you a tremendous amount of power. The United States power is not from making goods and the like. It really comes from the strength of the dollar and other countries depending upon it. So if you move to the Chinese currency, that takes that away from the United States and it weakens us. One of the things that set us on this road was when China offered to allow corporations to come in and use cheap labor, right? Basically slave labor is what it came down to, but cheap labor. And American corporations and European corporations, capitalist corporations, all ran and said, this is great, we can make more profit. So that's why you started seeing everything is made in China. And then when the government here said, this is problematic, the Congress came up with all sorts of ways of corrupting that. So basically, the Chinese government go ahead and continue to do what it was doing. But then, going back to LeBron James and other basketball players in China, basketball is a very big thing. So they get their own shoes to kind of sell. They're manufactured there and the like, and that makes more money for them. So should LeBron be doing that if it's in the long run going to corrupt the entire process? And is it okay for him to point to other people and say, well, they're doing it? Is that acceptable? Well, everyone else is corrupting it, so why shouldn't I? Well, no, in the moral sense, it's not good to do that. It's not good not to return that package. It's not good to do what serves you at the expense of others. We're going to talk about in a bit a tax that can be when there's negative externalities, and we'll discuss what those things are. But it's the same sort of idea. It's the same sort of idea. So there's all kinds of resources. So one of the major resources is any resource that creates energy. So right now, for example, there's great concern over the use of fossil fuels, and that renewables should be the way to go. So the logical question to ask is, since a major resource that filters its way through everything, because everything needs energy, you need energy to produce whatever you're going to produce. I mean, I'm sitting here, standing, and I'm lecturing, and I'm recording this. Well, I have a computer, right? That's a resource, and it's going to go to YouTube, which has a whole bunch of resources. Then you're going to connect to those, the YouTube and what have you, and you're going to look on your computers or on your phones or whatever, the lecture. None of this could happen without that technology, but the technology could have never happened without the resources. Not only the things that you need to put in a computer for a computer to be a computer, but also, right, the ability to get them out there and sell them and so on, so in order to create wealth and the like. So the idea here is, with the tragedy of the commons, is people are going to, once their brains are out of the jars and in bodies, they see who they are and they understand the place and time in which they live, they're going to try and corrupt the process. And that's the second thing, right, besides watching the line of liberty is, of the state saying you can't do that. Here's how capitalism works, and that creates the inefficiencies. The most efficient system is a capitalist system where the invisible hand makes all those decisions for you, because then it guides, it perfectly allows you to compete, perfect competition, if such a thing exists, and people are able to take advantage of the goods and services that you're offering, and supply and demand will determine the price they can get for that. And then that guides everything. If there's no demand for your product, you'll go out of business. If there's a great deal of demand for your product and you can't produce your product enough, and one of those things, right, is that supply chain. If the supply chain screws up, so you can manufacture it, but you can't get it where it needs to go, then the price goes up because the demand. If 10 people want to take one of my classes, and this is different because it's a state, city school and all, but the point is, if 1 million people want to take the class, then they start thinking, well, everybody wants to take this class, we could probably charge more for it, or find some other outlet for it. You can't register for it, but you can take a seminar, or you can come when the subject matter is being given to a broader audience. You just have to pay $200 for a ticket. Um, I mean, that's how it functions, right? Of course, in certain places, supply and demand don't matter. One of the things about a city school or state school, we're part of that system, is that it's really supported by tax dollars, by state budget, city budget. And so that's a whole other area of corruption, of corrupting the process. Now, I don't want to make it seem like the process is always corrupt. It is. It's just when it gets to the point where it's really changing things. So, for example, going back to the fossil fuels, since we need energy, the question is, what's the cheapest form of energy we can get in the marketplace that produces the biggest bang for the buck? And right now, by far, and 90% of the world relies upon it, it's fossil fuels. Now, there are negative externalities, which we'll talk about using fossil fuels. But here's the deal you have to make with the devil. Do we use fossil fuels, deal with their negative externalities, and maybe try and limit them, clean air and, statutes and all of that? Can we find a way to say this is the most, you can't get a bigger bang for your buck than a gallon of gas. A gallon of gas at the pump, think about it. 1 gallon, a little bit, will move tons of metal. It's very hard to get that from any other source. Now, we may want renewables if that makes the most sense. And certainly there are less negative externalities, but there are still negative externalities. You can't avoid that. So the question really is, what do you do? If you say no, we're going to forego those, more efficient fuel, then you've made a decision that your economy, for example, on a national level, is not going to do as well, because there's a cheaper and more more reliable source of energy. You can't escape the issue that with solar, you need the sun. Now, the panels are getting better, and so you may need less of that, but then how much energy can it produce, and so on and so forth, and how expensive is it? Then, wind or geothermal. We know, for example, nuclear, big bang for your buck, but people are concerned about that, right? If there's an economic disaster issue, it really affects everything. But we've not had many of those. As you look around the world, that's not happened very often. And you get a big bang for your buck there, right? Big bang for your buck. But the negative externalities, if something happens to that power plant or whatever, it could be devastating. And that's also true of fossil fuels. Going and drilling for them or what have you, all kinds of methodologies they use in order to get coal and get natural gas and get fossil fuels out of the ground can cause all kinds of devastation. So there's the deal you have to make with the devil. What do we do? Are we willing to have the economy recede because we're going off the most efficient type of fuel because we don't like the negative externalities? The negative externalities we place more value on and more weight on than the prosperity, let's say, that might come from cheaper energy source with externalities. Okay, so we're just making the assessment, but there are consequences for every decision we make. There are consequences, and no one really knows how far-reaching they'll be with any absolute certainty. But we know from experiencing it, right, the who, what, where, when, why, and how, we can make the comparison and say, this is really going to hurt the economy. So, for example, at this present moment, as the focus is on fossil fuel, going off fossil fuels, it's raising the cost of doing business. So the price of things go up. And when the price of things go up, fewer and fewer people can afford those things. Now, you can make the argument, so long as the goods are necessary goods that are not going up, it's fine. But when you see a loaf of bread going up, you think a lot of people, use bread for various things, or corn, or whatever it may be, and it's becoming more expensive. So I can't really afford it. So now we don't eat bread. And then after a while, it's like, well, don't I have the fundamental right to at least feed myself and my family with the money that I make because I give my labor in exchange for currency? See, these are very complicated issues. And when the decision is being made by the few, about what's going to happen, because it serves them in some way at your expense, is that something that's a corruption of the process, introduces an inefficiency and affects that invisible hand? Because if it does, your capitalist structure is now breaking down. And once that breaks down, supply and demand means nothing, right? And that means the market's not guided by any of that, but those corporate elites and those political elites and the elites in general, they can manipulate the entire system. And where they garner more of those 12 houses, and then people living on the street. So these are not, I mean, some things are nice in theory, and we would like them to be. Like, I'd like a world where there's always peace and where everybody has all their needs met. And I think we all want that when we're behind the veil or our brains are in a jar. It makes perfect sense that we would want those things. But right away, the corruption sets in. Think about tragedy of the commons. Think about these negative externalities. People trying to take advantage of the process for their own well-being. I mean, is Jeff Bezos really worth as much as he's worth? Does he add that much? Are people saving money getting products through Amazon? Or is he doing what typically happens? You have lower costs, so you sell your product at a cheaper price. People flock to you. You drive people out of the market because they can't compete with that price point. And then once everyone's out of the market, you raise your price until you're getting monopoly profits, which we'll talk about. And now we all suffer because we're paying more for an inferior good because they want to maximize their profits and their wealth. Whereas in an open market where there's that invisible hand, they can get away with that. Now, there are rules and laws that limit, antitrust laws, that limit monopolies, right? Vertical or horizontal. Vertical, which I'll explain those two things, but vertical is more understandable and it's less corruptive. It does introduce some efficiencies, but horizontal doesn't. Okay, so we'll get to that in a second. All right, so what we're saying here is that you're going to have a breakdown to tragedy because the corruption sets in. So it's interesting. Rawls' Veil of Ignorance tells us what fundamentally we should all be striving for and what kind of structure. Tragedy of the Commons says, yeah, good luck with that because it's going to get corrupted. And it does. Even democracy can be corrupt. You'll see when we get to the process, what happens if the Congress ignores what the courts say or the president ignores what Congress or the courts say. Then you don't really have a democracy anymore, and you don't really have, depending upon what that person does, you don't really have an economy that's functioning anymore. You have it just serving those elites and what they want. The political process gets corrupted. And I think in America, one of the major, and there's tons of people that disagree with me, they're just wrong. But the point is that if you look at Democrats and you look at Republicans and you look at when they've controlled the White House or the Congress, right, or both. So you've got the Senate and the House, and you've got the executive, right, the president. But when one party has all three of those, they function very differently than when the party has, say, one. Like the president is a Democrat, but the House and the Senate are both Republican run or controlled. Do the checks and balances work better there? In some measure, yes, right? Unless both parties are in on it, and I would make the argument that they are. That's discernible. I don't think that you can argue with that. I think that we go into some sort of denial when we say, well, this party is better than that party. Then you say, okay, let's take a clear look at what they've accomplished and done while they've controlled the levers of government and their need for money. A very bad Supreme Court decision was Citizens United, where basically they said spending money is speech. So those that have more money have more speech than others. That's a corruption. Very bad decision in my view. So what we're looking at here is this process that will get corrupted because that's human nature, and then the government and the procedures should actually change that. But again, if you look at the federal government, and we know the federal law is the supreme law of the land, and you look at how often each party has controlled all three, the House, the Senate, and the executive branch, it's about equal. Both parties have controlled all three of those things. If you look at which party has had the House and not the Senate and not the executive branch, it's also about equal. So, cut to the chase here, they've all had control over different levers of government, and whether it's all three or one of the three, and so on and so forth. So that means that they've all had the same opportunity to affect their own policy ends. So then you have to ask yourself, look where we are now, and ask yourself, what do the two parties stand for? And have they delivered on that? And I would argue that there's collusion between the parties and the elites, especially running the chambers. I mean, you look at Nancy Pelosi right now, Speaker of the House, and you look at Mitch McConnell, right, Majority Leader in the Senate. I would argue if you look at what they're doing, not only policies, but what benefits them, you realize they have similar interests. Now, when they have similar interests, is one going to move against the other because it serves their constituents? That's the way it's supposed to work. But does it work that way? And I would argue, take a close look, I think you'll be surprised, that that's not been the case. And that's pretty much the case with all elites. They are serving themselves because that's what people do. But when you can distort the system, there's nothing to keep you in check. So things like, if you've taken American government, revolving door, issue networks, things like that, they corrupt that process. When someone works for Citibank or Bank of America or Chase or what have you, when they work for that bank and they come in to the government, right, in one of the cabinet positions, overseeing an area that their company actually is involved in, and then when they leave that position, they go back to that company, well, it's an inside job. You've just placed someone whose concerns are the benefit of the company because that's where they're going to thrive. And so they want policies that are going to work for that industry, right? If they go against the industry, they're never going back and working in it. And that means that, they're going to be in, they're not going to have the wealth they want. And the history is loaded with that. Over and over and over again in all types of government structures. And it's because corruption will begin immediately and it will just, as it succeeds, it will just get larger and larger. For example, BP got the sole right to drill for oil in the Gulf. They also had the worst environmental record. They had the most problems. And drilling in the seabed, they had no experience with. So they screwed up and all this oil spewed out. Now, they're a very powerful company, and a lot of people that are elites have an interest in that company. But here's this major disaster. It's got a lot of publicity, so they're going to have to clean it up, right? They have no choice but to clean it up. But the president at that time was Barack Obama, and he did what is normal in that structure. He didn't do anything that was unique to him. He had to do something, so he calls in the CEO, and they think, oh, this could go very poorly. And Barack Obama says to them, listen, you guys have got to clean up this act, and, the public's really enraged by this. So he says basically, okay, you're going to get charged a penalty for this. And I forget what the amount was. Let's say it's $100 million or $1 billion. Doesn't really matter. They willfully and gladly paid that because they were going to make so much more money now. But the public perceived that as, boy, they really got punished by this, right? So they didn't. But that's the perception, right? And again, they all do it. It's not peculiar to any one politician from any one party. This is how they do it. When you have a system where money is required and needed to run for office and keep your power, you need to do the bidding of those who give you that money. That's as natural as it gets, right? That's as natural as it gets. You can't afford to bite the hand that feeds you and allows you to increase your resources. And the interesting thing is that Americans tend to think that those that are elites, especially if they, wealth, they must know more than you because they're wealthy. We place that standard on it. When in fact, who says that's the case at all? That they really know what they're doing. when you have a lot of people contributing and policy being developed with a focus on maximizing the utility of everyone, you get a much better outcome. If you don't, and you start corrupting the system, because it will give you more power if you corrupt it in a certain way, then what begins to happen is the person that agreed used to be a social contract, right? Okay, you're really wealthy. We'll fight the wars and we'll do the hard work, but you have to treat us fairly. That idea has pretty much just disintegrated because we've allowed it to disintegrate. And part of that is the court's problem, the judicial procedure. It's also a major political and elite problem. Their families get more, and the middle class begins to get evaporated. So this is not just some theory that, oh, this is interesting. This has, the fundamental idea of the tragedy of the commons is rife throughout the entire structure, right? Throughout the entire structure. Even, for example, and I'm going to get a lot of people upset by this, but unions. Think about a union. A union exists to give its union members more and more, right? I mean, unions don't say, well, we got you this great raise or this pay, and now we're done. It's like, no, now you got to go get more. In budgets, in the government, they always expand because you don't want your department on the federal level. It's the state level is true too, but on the federal level, if you have a budget of $10, you don't want to spend $9.50. What you want to do is show that you need $11. So more and more waste, because you got to get rid of it. More and more waste. And same on college campuses. We have money for this to do research. Someone's got to do it because we want to get more money. Because the more money we get in our area, in our department, the more valuable we are to the institution, the more we can get more stuff for us. That's the dynamic. But with unions, think about it. They can only push the corporations so far before they say, no, we can't afford to do this. You're eating too much into our profits. And what has become the goal of corporations, which is pretty much recent, is that the job of corporations is not to engage in the open market, if you will, the invisible hand, is to bring the greatest amount of return to their stockholders. So we're out to make money for our stockholders, not necessarily produce the best product at the best price. And we can do that by controlling the market and adding in inefficiencies that serve us. The judicial process is the least corrupt in terms of the structures of governments because they are, for the most part, separate from the political structure. That's why appointing judges for life means they don't have to worry about, serving anyone. That's presumably the way it works. Okay, so when you think about that corruption, you begin to see that you really can't break free of it. So you want to mitigate it and minimize it as best you can. And that's not always possible. It's not always possible. And we'll talk about other things I've said that demonstrate some of the stuff I've talked about at this point so that we can give you a better idea of it. So I want to talk about this idea of, resources and precious metals, forests, the atmosphere, oceans, weather patterns. All of these are resources. Think about farmers. They depend upon rain. They don't get rain, that's problematic. They depend upon getting water. California has a very large need because of the farming industry there for water. So there's always a competition for water. And so the idea is that you have to go ahead and you have to somehow extract the right to get more water than somebody else. So going back to the union idea, right, we have to keep upping it. The union can only up it so far because corporations want to take care of their stockholders. That's the impetus. By the way, CEOs always get more money, and they just fire people at the bottom or what have you. All right, so the idea is that the union, this is what I'm getting in trouble for, the union really can serve the purposes that we think it should serve. They might be able to get in terms of money, getting more money, but they could serve a purpose in terms of making the workplace safer. They're a government agency that does that, but they could say we want this for our And then again, it still comes down to cost because the organization that the union represents is going to say, well, this is going to cost us too much. We can't do this. And so they have to cut back maybe on some safety measures. And then bad things happen, and people behind the veil never say it's okay for the betterment of some that we suffer more. The idea is you don't have that, right? You have something more in line with, what everybody expects their government to do for them. But the governments, all governments, are corrupt in some way, and I would argue that the United States government is just as corrupt in different ways. And capitalism is vulnerable to manipulation. Just got to stop that free hand a bit and just make it turn a certain way. And so when you align yourself with one party or another, you're making the assumption that overall this party wants things that are closer to what we all want, and we'll actually get them. All politicians talk a good game. That's what politicians do. The question is, what can they deliver? And then the manner in which it gets delivered and so on and so forth really depends upon how much you can manipulate that structure. So as soon as you move people out of that veil of ignorance, the corruption begins. And that's why there's the need for a state, a government, to try and mitigate that. But the governments usually become corrupt. And the last place to get corrupt is usually the judicial, those that are responsible for meting out punishment or some sort of understanding of what the law is so that people can then follow it and, you have the structure you want because everyone's following the laws you put in place, and those laws are supposed to advance some good. Look, under the equal amount of time that both parties are controlled, all the governmental apparatus, right? What's happened? There's been a major concentration of wealth, a really decimating of the middle class, which you really need because that's who the people are that buy and stuff, and other things, fight the wars. And more, people have less and less say. This comes at the hands of both parties. Both parties, rather. I don't want to be too dramatic here and say they have blood on their hands, but both parties are corrupt. And so one way you can sort of get around that is you don't align with a party, and that's why a lot of people are independent. What you do is you align with policy. So I like that policy, not necessarily that politician, but that policy. But I don't like the way they even acted, so it didn't do me any good, so I won't vote for that person again. So the idea of the vote in a democratic structure society is really important because that's your leverage, right? The marketplace of ideas, people then vote. So then today we have this question, well, who has a right to vote? Does anyone have a right to vote? And again, you reason your way through that, like, okay, why do we want only certain people to vote and not other people? Or why do we want to expand the voting base? Should only citizens be allowed to vote? What are the consequences if citizens are not the only ones that can vote? And right now, the idea, if you look at it, of open borders, is people are coming across, they're not citizens, they have not yet become citizens, they've not gone through the normal process of citizenship. But if you want to give them the vote, then what's to stop people from coming in that want to vote a certain way so they can change the structure that might benefit them? So is citizenship even important? And that's a whole other issue altogether. There's lots of things going on that really need more thought. And when people align with a party, they tend to accept the party line as being the right line. Oh, these people are good. That just, I think that just ignores the fact that politicians are politicians and they serve themselves, which is what we expect. You don't get people that want to be politicians because they're angels, because they're so concerned with the public good. Now, I'm not saying they all don't care. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying on the margins, there's a lot of cheating going on. When you look at the media also has a lot of power. And because there's been an advancement in technology, and you went from having 3 television stations, now you've got don't even know the number of news sources out there. They're competing for an audience. So it makes sense for them to go to the lowest common denominator and get as big an audience they can, get them angry on both sides. Conservative and liberal, they're all doing it so that people lock down and stay with them, and that gives them more power. So the question is then, do they go about doing anything about it? And if they don't, then they don't. It used to be the media was responsible for being sort of the intermediate institution between the people and the government, that they would express what the people were feeling and so on and so forth. It's not so much the case anymore. Now you've got your far right, your far left, you've got your centrists, and everybody's advocating their own point of view, but not in a competitive way, in a way to capture markets. And that's really problematic for all the reasons we've talked about up to this point. So if you look at things like, for example, global warming, there's a tragedy of the commons. Everybody could dump pollutants into the air, let's say, right? And we believe that causes global warming, and that's bad for the environment. And so those that cheat on the margins and spew more into the air, because it's cheaper to do that than keep it clean, and we allow them to do that, it creates a problem. It gives them an advantage. For example, if an international organization like the UN says, we're going to consider China a developing nation, and according to our rules, we allow developing nations to use fossil fuels more and pollute a bit more because they're trying to get things up and running. No one today could possibly believe that China, right, is a developing nation. So how do they keep on getting this opportunity? Well, if you look at the structure of the UN, for example, the Security Council, anyone votes against something, the whole thing falls. And it's all these major nations, right? It's always someone from a poorer nation that heads the place, right? Secretary General, it looks good, but whatever country they represent is not going to be of any real, have any real clout. The clout really resides with those folks that are on the Security Council that make the decisions. And those are the very few nations. And so why are they allowing China to do this? Is there corporate structure back home saying we want to go to China and make our goods there because our goods there are cheaper for us to make and we make more profit here and we give some profit to you guys because you want to run for office. So what do you want to do? It sounds very cynical, I know. But that's what this area is. It's filled with all kinds of rationales to be a cynic. And we should be. I think when you start taking these things on blind faith, that people do this, that, the other thing, that they're reliable, I think that really becomes problematic in a lot of ways. All right, so tragedy of the commons is just a fundamental basic example. It's a conjured up example to demonstrate what happens when there are market inefficiencies. In that case, it was one, no one's responsible for any of the, maintaining the area or what have you. That becomes problematic, and no one really is going to do anything about it. And eventually, you get a wasting away of that particular area. Okay, so I wanted to get through a little bit more in this lecture about the Department of Justice and all that. I'm trying to figure out if I start on it, how far I can get before I have to stop. And I think what I want to do is I want to save, put off starting this and try to do it all in one lecture. The antitrust stuff, the Department of Justice, and then talking about, these negative externalities, a little bit more a Pigovian tax and how the government works that. There's all kinds of manipulations of that as well. And then talk about judges, the different types of judges and so on and so forth. I'm leading up to putting the process in a context that tells you what's really behind it, and a vocabulary that will help you understand exactly how things are, sort of defined. When people say it's a moral issue, and in fact, no one said it's a good thing. When the public hasn't spoken yet, but they say this is moral. Is it moral to allow people to have lost their businesses and their homes and live on the street? Is it moral to say that there's mental illness and these people can't take care of themselves? But decades ago, we decided we're going to just mainstream them. they're not going to hurt anybody, so we're not going to have institutions we've got to pay for to take care of them. So we're going to not worry about mental illness. Then you get something like gun violence coming up. You think of Sandy Hook, for example. That was horrific, and there have been many, many more horrific events after that of a similar nature. No one wants to say, well, maybe these people are mentally ill that do this. It's not normal. Normal people don't do this. But the question then becomes, is mental illness something we can really determine? How do we assess that? How do we assess if a person is mentally ill? And do we have a right to go digging to see if they're mentally ill? And then once we determine how to define mental illness, can those in power that want to get rid of a political opponent, or want to minimize a group, or a leader of a group, or they just want to go after an individual, can they go ahead and just say, we've done our examination, this person is mentally ill, and we have to institutionalize them? I mean, you see that in dictatorships, right? Re-education camps. They're not educating anybody. It's like, you're going to do it our way, or you're going to suffer the consequences. So I'm going to wait to the next lecture to get into all of those things, because I think they're really important. And the goal here is eventually, I know they're important, the goal here is eventually, when I've given you this frame of reference, and you understand a lot more about how we're looking at things, then the next step is to go into the rule of law. And what is that, how it gets applied, how it fits into all of what we're talking about here, and I will talk about in the next lecture or two or three. And then when we get that world together, there's a midterm, and then we say, okay, great, here are all these cases that we're going to look at. And now we're going to look at them with a bit more sophistication. And then we're going to end up at the two most important cases right now, which deal with gun rights and a woman's right to choose. Those are the last two cases we'll look at, but we'll have some context for this. I want to end the lecture by saying, once again, and reinforcing, that I don't view my job as advocating for a particular doctrine or political party or any of it. My job is to say, okay, as best as I can, here are the things that are important. Here's how you have to look at them, and here's how we piece it together. And you are free to criticize that, but you have to have facts and and reason something, reason yourself to it. But this is hopefully making you a better integrative thinker and giving you more information that you can then expand upon, so you can understand the process and why the process is important and what the issues are when that process gets corrupt, because it affects your lives directly. And I mean directly. What kind of job you can get, how what things you can acquire, how much security you have, all the things that behind the veil of ignorance, when your head is in a jar, your brain's in a jar, all the things you say that the state, the government, which you formed, should do for you, when they're not doing any of those, or they've corrupted to a point where it's working against you, then what happens? So it's a slippery slope. Any one governmental policy may not be a big thing at all, but as they accumulate and the motivation behind them, I would tell you all this. If you go back and you look at people that entered the Congress, in the House or the Senate, and look at their financial worth, which is part of the public record. When they filed a run, you can see that. And you look at what they're worth now, which is also part of the public record, they all get paid the same salary. And they get paid the same salary year in, year out, except if they up it. But they don't up it to like millions of dollars. Yet how is it during that same period of time they've all become millionaires? How is it that during that same time they've created policies that benefit those that contribute to their campaigns? Right? You begin to see a pattern of, corruption. And I use that word, it sounds like it's such a harsh word, but manipulation is a better word. You see major manipulation going on, and it works to your disadvantage. That creates a problem, because we all agreed to the government, because the idea was that we all wanted these certain liberties and opportunities to get on the playing field, and that's eroding. And that's a very dangerous thing for a democracy. And the question today for America is, what is the health or the well-being of the democracy? of the capitalist state, right? Why are policies that are being enacted today being enacted in any era? Why is that happening? Little by little, what you begin to see is this manipulation. And the more you know about it and understand it, the more you can resist it. Now, what's probably going through your mind, other than I wish this lecture would end, is how can you take advantage of it? I'm learning more and more so I can take advantage of the system. It doesn't mean you're a horrible human being, it just means you're a human being. And so the idea collectively is we should control that as much as we can. And what aids in that is the legal process, the judicial process. The courts are the final arbiter, the Supreme Court, of what the law is and means. And as such, they need to be non-political at all. They cannot be political because they're corrupt. We give them lifetime appointments. It's like tenure, right, for professors. So they're free of the process of having to keep their job by catering to people that support them. Now, not all judges are appointed. Some are elected, and then those people are suffering the same consequences or the same environment as others that are in other areas where it's about profit and so on. But those that are appointed and are given lifetime appointments are free of the political structure. But recently, we've seen that, in the case of the Supreme Court justices have come under fire, and people are protesting against them individually. They're trying to force them to be political. And if they yield to that, the court system's dead. Because we need the court to make decisions based on the rule of law, and we'll explore all that stuff. The structure that's going to maximize the utility of the greatest number of people in a moral way. Okay? Maximize the utility of people in a moral way. And if you do that, society remains strong, the government remains strong, the manipulation is minimized, and we all get greater utility out of it, whatever that may be. If we turn a blind eye to it, it will only get more corrosive. It will only become more corrupt. And that means less and less will we represent some sort of democracy. And democracy is important because it says we all have a right to speak our voice and move the system in a way where we can get up on the playing field. And after all, isn't that why we want a government? To protect that, not to advance themselves, but to protect it for all of us. That should be the goal. Otherwise, why have the government? If we're going to end up, having ourselves in a brutish place where we're just manipulated and sort of beat down, we need to form a government. We could have just had that under natural order, natural conditions, right? Survival of the fittest. We could have just done it that way. So we end up where we didn't want to be, but we put everything in place so we wouldn't have to be in that other place that we don't want to be. But then we didn't watch it, and we didn't fight for it, and we allowed ourselves to be a little bit corrupted by it as well. And now the very system we put in place to maximize utility is beginning to eat away at the sustenance of people, minimizing their utility, and people are allowing it to happen. Okay? All right, that ends the second lecture. We'll move forward from there to the other things that I talked about at the top that we're going to discuss, various theorists and philosophers, to get a sense about what they think the state should be and what the responsibilities of a state are. All of this, again, is laying the groundwork, including the rule of law lectures, to get us to a place where we kind of can think integratively about the cases we're going to look at. All right, that ends lecture 2. We will pick it up next time when we get to lecture 3.